today we're going to talk about causation. We're going to talk about increasing productivity in the Americas. Sorry, in the whole world, not the Americas. Sorry. And so before we get going, though, I'd like you to think about something, because I think this phrase, increasing productivity, is a little confusing. And so I want you to think a little bit about something, an analogy to maybe help you kind of understand a little bit about what we're going to do here. So think about this. And you can go ahead and throw something in the comments or in the chat. But how much do your parents do for you? I know you're thinking like, oh, that's obvious. Like, I know what my parents do for me. But really, like, just take a second and think about it. How much do your parents do for you? Thinking about all the things that they do for you. Some of the things you might think about is the fact that they provision you with a certain amount of food, right? They put a roof over your head. For some of you, they might assist you with going to university, going to college. For others, they make it possible for you to do wonderful after-school activities. But all these things your parents do for you, by nature of being your parents. But what would happen if you had, say, a sibling, like I do? I have a younger sibling. I don't know about anybody else, but think about that. What does that mean if you have a sibling? What impact does that have on your parents? Right, things might be doubly expensive. Everything is double, right? Now they got to do twice the food. They possibly have to sign up for twice the activities. They have to go to 2 times as many teacher-parent conferences. Boy, that sounds like a lot, right? But a good way to think about it is, just like your parents, if they had 2 children, would have to do more and be more productive with those 2 children. It's the same way that many states across Eurasia and across the Americas became more productive over the course of the first unit of AP World. And even a little bit before that, we're extending it backwards into the 600s. So that's the way I'd like you to think about it, right? We think about productivity not just as in more stuff, but also the fact that because you have more stuff, now you have to you have more resources to work with, right? It's a two-way street. They have more children, like your parents now have more children, but that also means that they have more commitments, right? So productivity is a two-way street. And that's kind of like what I'd like you to think about going into this today, is that increased productivity, it means not only do you have more stuff, but also that you might have more obligations, right? There are other effects besides just having more stuff. All right. With that nice little warm-up, let's talk a little bit more about what we're going to talk about today. So as I was saying, more food, more provisions, more activities. So today's topic, officially, according to the AP World Modern History, official guidelines, is that we're to look at strictly environmental consequences, right? Topic 2.6, the environmental consequences of connectivity is the term they use, right? And specifically, they want us to talk about the environment. But we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to talk about more than just the environment. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk a little bit about the economy. So while the environment's really important, and that's what you'd need to know for the AP exam, we're going to talk a little bit more about the impact on politics, the impact on art and culture, and human demographics. So we're going to expand on that a little bit. And because we're going to expand on that a little bit, I wanted to show you something that some of you might have seen or maybe you haven't seen, is that the old AP World History Standards, pre-2019, had a different key concept that they used to kind of touch on this topic. I think it captures the idea of what we're talking about today a little bit better. So back when Unit 2 is actually Unit 3, there was a key concept, and it was literally just this. It was increased economic productivity and its consequences, increased economic productive capacity and its consequences. I think this much more encapsulates what we're talking about. In other words, yes, there were environmental consequences, which is what they want us to focus on now, but there were a lot of other consequences as well. Political, social, to have a graphic. There were many consequences. And so that's why I just want to reference this really quick because it gives an idea of what we're doing today. And Eric says, consequences can provide context for a lot of other events. That's a good way to look at it, right? Some of the stuff we're going to talk about today can be context for other time periods that we're going to see later on down the road, as well as just evidence for, say, an LEQ or an SAQ in their own right. So it's a good way to look at it. Good way to look at it. So I just want to give you this old key concept so you have an idea of what we're looking at. So where are we going to look at today? Well, we're going to look at, well, all over the world. This is one of the first streams I've done, and hopefully it won't be the last, that is actual world history, where we are going to actually talk about things all over the world. We're going to talk about growing productivity in the Americas. We're going to talk about growing productivity in parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Europe. So we're really going to do, in hopefully the span of about 50 minutes, we're going to hit on a lot of parts of the world. So as they say, you know, buckle on up. It's going to be a wild ride. So, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about causation, because all of this increasing productivity is both a cause and an effect. And it's really important to recall that causation is one of the AP World skills that you are required to know. So if you look on the right here, you can see that causation is the reasoning process number 2. And just like the other reasoning processes, you have to describe and explain, right? You will probably see causation at some part of the AP exam, but it's not entirely certain which. It could be a multiple choice question. It could be in the SAQ. They might say, explain the causes of something or explain the effects of something, right? Or it might just be identify the causes of something, identify the effects of something. For those of you who are going to go see the LEQ stream later this week, I'm certain that she will, Melissa will break down the different ways to write an LEQ, and one of which is to use a sort of causation framework in your LEQ. So some of the stuff you learn here tonight, maybe you can take with you and use, practice with when you get to that LEQ stream this coming week. So. Yeah, you might also, again, you might see a multiple choice question where it asks you to explain an effect of a stimulus that's described or a consequence of a stimulus that's described. It's not unheard of. You will probably encounter something like that. And we'll do a little practice with that a little bit later on. So just like the other historical reasoning processes, there's the describe part, there's the what. What is the cause? What is the effect? There's also the why. So why is this a cause? Or why is this an effect of this particular event? Or why is this a cause of this particular event, right? And then there's also something called relative historical significance. And this is the kind of thing that, again, you do this automatic. I know it's a separate thing here when you look at it here, but in a way you are doing this when you write an essay. You are making a claim about what is the most important cause or what is the most important effect, because you're using that as evidence. You're making an argument that A is way more important than B, and because A is more important than B, I'm going to write about it in my essay. So some people get a little weirded out. They see that like the relative historical significance, but you do that automatically, kind of whether you know it or not, just by nature of the fact that you're choosing evidence. You could be explicit with it and say, this was way more important than this. And that might be good for the complexity point, but it's just something to keep in mind. So as always, you need to identify what you're looking at. You need to identify why something is a cause or an effect. And then you'd also potentially need to say, this was the most important cause or the most important effect. So for example, if I were to ask you, what was the most important, if I were to ask you to identify what was the most important reason, or what was the primary reason, what was the primary cause that led you to take AP World, you might say something, what my students have said over the course of these couple weeks is, oh, I wanted to improve my writing skills. And so that would be the cause, right? Now, that wouldn't be an explanation. That would just be a description, right? I want to improve my writing skills. In fact, while we're here, why don't you go ahead and throw it in the chat. Why did you take AP World? Think about it in causation terms. What's the cause of you taking AP World? Now, what my students have also said is, so if one student said they wanted to get better at writing, that was the what. And then the why might be, oh, I've struggled with writing for a long time. I've struggled to find my voice, and therefore I decided to take AP World because I heard it really, kicks your butt in terms of writing. And therefore, this was the reason why I chose to take AP World. Camilla, I hope I'm saying that right, says it was mandatory. Well, that's also a reason. That's also definitely one reason why you might find yourself taking an AP class. But it is good for writing. That's true. And a lot of my students haven't taken an AP before. This is their first AP for a lot of them, and it's a different type of writing. History analysis is a little bit of a different beast than, for example, like literary analysis you might do in an English class. So it's a learning experience all around. But you should it's always good to take on a challenge. And so I hope we look at this as a learning experience, all of us, both teacher and student. So, and Eric says he wants to understand the world today. Well, shoot, I do too. That's part of the reason why I teach this class. It gives me an opportunity to really trace the contours of the world today backwards in time, a little retro stuff. But anyway, so that was just a short example of how to think about a breakdown of causation. A way to think about causation is something that could help visualize it for you. Could be causation as a collision, right? So if you think about a collision, if you've ever seen a car crash, a bicycle crash, people bump into each other, right? Something happens, and then something else happens, right? You have a collision, kind of like this image right here, where you have two marbles crashing into each other, and then as a result, one marble is sent this way. In physics, they call this a transfer of energy and momentum. But here we could just call it causation, because there's an event, there's a cause of that event, and there's an effect of that event, right? I forgot to fix the caption right there. That's a little embarrassing. But this is a good way to think about it. There's a cause, there's an event, and there's an effect, right? And a good way to think about it is think about something big that happened in your life, something maybe happy or maybe something sad. You can probably remember what led up to that happy or sad event, the cause of that happy or sad event, and you can probably remember how it made you feel afterwards, right? And that's, again, thinking about causation would be, if you were to take that event and then write an essay about it, it could be that you had, there were very obvious signs that this was going to happen. There were very obvious causes of it, and then there were very obvious after effects of it. So you can always think about, evidence in your life. So what I ask my students is, well, how did you meet your best friend? And then they usually have a story about, oh, we were in the same class. Oh, we were on the same sports team. They usually have a story. And so again, if you're ever kind of unsure about what causation means, just think about meeting your best friend, right? How did it happen? And how has your best friend had an impact on you ever since? For those a little more logically inclined, here's another way to think about it. A and B. A being the cause and B being the effect. So if you're looking for A, then the question is, if you're looking for the cause, then how did A cause B, right? And if you're looking at the effect, then you're asking, how is B an effect of A, right? And of course, as always, why is this the case? Why, it's one thing to simply say this caused this, but in AP World, in historical writing, you also need to kind of back it up, if you will, right? This caused this because yada, 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 or this is a consequence or an effect of this because yada, 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 whatever it is. And we'll have some practice in here, don't worry. Just want to really nail home that we got this causation before we go ahead and actually talk about some examples of productivity. Awesome. So really quick, a few notes about increasing productivity between the years like 1000 and 1450. And some of what we're going to talk about goes a little bit further back. So this term increasing productivity refers to an increase in human activity that results in the increase in production of goods. Now, goods, what could goods stand for? I put this word in here purposefully. What could goods stand for? I say, in your textbook it says goods, your teacher says goods. I recently had kind of a discussion with a student about what qualified as a trade good, what didn't qualify as a trade good. But I say this word goods, and what do you think? I say goods, and what's the first thing that comes into your mind? You can go ahead and maybe throw that in the comments there. I say good, you say products. That's definitely a good way to think about it. Human-made products, perhaps. That's a possibility. Products is another good word for goods. I shouldn't say good. It's a well-chosen word for goods, just so we're not confusing ourselves. Yeah, I might say when I think of trade, when I think of goods, one of the first things that always comes to my mind is like Chinese porcelain. That's like the good, the fancy good of this time period. Eric says something that a person is willing to give up something to receive. It's something that people are willing to trade, maybe, right? Or desired by others. That's also an excellent way to put it, right? Something that you make or that you grow or that you create, it's desired by others. That's a good way to look at it, yeah. Awesome. And in this case, yes, goods could mean commercial goods. And then, like I said earlier, porcelain is probably the more famous one during this time period from China, found all over the Indian Ocean, both on land and underwater. But that could also include agricultural goods, right? So it's not just trade goods. It could also be agricultural goods. And it could be cultural goods, just goods that are produced by a culture. Something like an Islamic rug, the export of which became a very big deal during the early days of Dar al-Islam, because prayer rugs were viewed as an essential element of what it meant to be a Muslim. And so these were very popular, especially, they're still popular today. If you know any Muslims, you know that they usually will take a prayer rug to the mosque, or a mosque would have a prayer rug for them. So this is still a big deal today. And back then it was a big deal too. So goods means many things. But today we're mostly going to focus on agricultural goods, right? This increasing productivity is going to refer to agriculture and the production of food for human consumption, sometimes for trade, but mostly for human consumption or human use. And so this will include things like new crops or old crops in new places, a fairly common thing. And it will also include things like technology or what we would call agricultural knowledge. And so a quick example I have for you right here is a picture of something called the sakia wheel. And this is actually a kind of wheel that's powered by an animal that was the earliest records of it we have indicate that it came from India. But by the year 1000, it was found as far away as Spain and as far south as East Africa. And part of the reason is because this had been diffused through India to these places via the spread of Islam. Muslims had moved into northern India, they'd seen this technology, and then they had sort of shown it to some of their compatriots who had then gone off to other places and taken this technology with them. So when we think about increasing productivity, it's not just that there's more food. There is more food, but it's not just that there's more food. It's that there's more knowledge and there's more technology, which I think it's one of the great things about the AP World Course this year is that technology is now a theme. And so there's a spot for this. When we talk about increasing productivity, it also means knowledge of agriculture and technology that's related to agriculture. It's going to be a big part of this whole thing. So that's just a little preface before we kind of get into it. So just a real quick overview again. We're going to be talking about the Americas. We're going to be talking about South America and Central Mexico. We're going to be talking about Northern Europe. We're going to be talking about the Dar al-Islam realm, which is roughly found here. We're going to be talking about East Africa, and we're going to be talking about Southeast Asia and southern China. Now, what you might notice, just kind of glancing at this, is that a lot of these places are connected already in some way, shape, or form. Right? A lot of these regions already have networks that are already established within them. So that's an astute observation to make. And so that's, if you notice that, it's a good thing going forward. But just a quick refresher on that. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some vocabulary that you might need to learn. So if you're taking notes, a little paper and pencil, now would be a good time to get it out. So a couple terms that we're going to use, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about them. So I already told you about the SAQ wheel. I also want to tell you a little about the moldboard plow, which is a special kind of iron plow that we see introduced into Northern Europe in the turn of the first millennium, and it increases the production of food by digging much deeper into the soil than previous plows have been able to do. So this is a real game changer when it comes to agricultural production. In China, we have something called the equal field system, and this is really important. This is a form of agricultural organization, right? This is a government policy, but what it does is it gives every farmer, peasant, an equal piece of land. No one has more than anybody else in theory and a little bit in practice. Obviously, it's not going to be a perfect distribution, but it made sure that farmers had their own land and that land was legally protected by law. No one could just come in and take it, right? So this protected the land of farmers, and this allowed them to grow crops with a certainty that their land was going to remain their land. And last but not least, we have something from the Americas, something called the Champa. If you saw my last stream about the Americas in 1200 to 1450, I talked a little bit about the Champas. They're a type of like an island on a swamp that the Mexica people used to grow food. What they did was they would literally drag the mud out of the bottom of the lake, and then they would pile it up until it became a mountain kind of on the lake. And because they had dredged up all the silt and the minerals and the good stuff in the bottom of the lake, this land was very fertile. And so every time they had to kind of dredge up everything out of the lake, it was great soil for growing food. And so this way provided a lot more crops than previous methods had of just kind of farming on the land. It also helped that their capital was in the middle of a gigantic lake. That helped. So there are lots of Champas. There aren't very many today, although there are some photos. You can Google them. There were photos of them. There were still a lot of them around Mexico City at the turn of the 19th century, or at the turn of the 20th century. There were still a lot of them there. Not too many today, but if you go really far outside of Mexico City, you can still find them in some places. So it's not a dead form of agriculture still there. Anywho, let's kick off the discussion by talking about Dar al-Islam, the Islamic realm. So when we talk about increasing productivity, there are some causes of this increasing productivity. So if you were to ask, what are the causes and effects of increasing productivity? Well, you could point to some causes. You would first off, just the spread of Islam itself was a pretty big deal, right? You have the creation of a cultural zone where everybody knows everybody else on a religious level, right? No matter where you go. You might remember Ibn Battuta. Maybe your teacher talked about him, the famous Muslim cleric and traveler. Has anybody's teacher talked about Ibn Battuta yet? Just out of curiosity. He's really big in AP world. I would be very surprised if someone's teacher had not at least brought him up maybe once. Yeah. Now, Camille says yes. All right. And what's so important about Ibn Battuta is that he lived in a big cultural zone on his travels. No matter where he went, he almost always encountered fellow Muslims. Like, that is how large this cultural zone became, right? The ease of communication across geographic regions. It was a really big deal. But in addition to this cultural zone, we also have the physical zone, the physical territory the Islamic Caliphate took over, which included places in North India, parts of Spain, and North Africa. And of course, these regions all had different crops and different agricultural technologies. And because though they were all incorporated into this one realm, they could spread all over the place, right? The same thing with the Indian Ocean. You have Islamic merchants all over the Indian Ocean, acquiring knowledge and trade goods and food and taking them back wherever they go. And so those things all allowed for rapid diffusion of crops. And last but not least, you have the Islamic translation of what we might call ancient knowledge. That's the term that's sometimes used in the textbooks. Specifically, these are Greek and Indian texts that are originally sometimes in Sanskrit, sometimes in ancient Greek. These texts, although they were not lost, were greatly prized by the Muslim clerics and scholars, who translated them into Arabic and then widely spread them everywhere. And while most of the more famous ones were on things like logic or mathematics, some of them were on things as simple as agriculture and horticulture. And so this kind of translation of texts can't be denied as an important cause of the increase in productivity. And Eric is telling me that Miss Longnecker has a live review of the Medieval Travelers coming in a couple weeks. So if you want to learn a little more about Ibn Battuta, let's check out Miss Longnecker's review in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned for that. But anyway, so you have the creation of this zone, you have the spread of all this new technology and new products, and specifically what products you have include the diffusion of crops such as sugar and spices, and in particular citrus, in the direction of Europe. So for example, Europeans first encountered sugar when they invaded the Islamic lands during the Crusades. They invaded the coast, what's now Palestine and Lebanon and Israel. They encountered sugar and they liked it a lot, and they brought it back to the only part of Europe that would grow on, which was Southern Europe and parts of Spain and parts of Sicily and parts of the southern part of the Mediterranean. But this was the beginning of Europe's great taste for sugar, was when they encountered it in the Islamic lands during the Crusades. Because Muslims had brought it to the Middle East from India. Muslims had been to India, they'd seen this cane sugar that the Indians had begun processing about 500 years earlier, and they said, hot dog, this is good stuff. Let's take this back and grow it in Mesopotamia, where we already grow lots of food, where the climate is perfect for it. And so we see the diffusion of foods that require a hotter climate towards Europe, specifically the Middle East. In Africa, rice was not totally known. However, when Muslims entered Africa, both as merchants and as warriors, they brought rice with them. And nowadays, rice is a huge part of the diets of many African countries, in West Africa and in East Africa too. So rice was a really big deal. And when it was spread into Africa, you get a lot of dishes that now have rice as a primary ingredient. You also have the diffusion of cotton, but not just cotton. You also have cotton technologies. And by that, I mean, how do you make cotton? What methods do you use to produce cotton? These had long been known in India. The spinning wheel and other methods of producing cotton had long been known in India. And cotton production itself had long been known in India. And so the Muslims begin to produce cotton in the Middle East. And by the Middle East, I'm referring to Mesopotamia, parts of Southern Arabia, the places where cotton can be domesticated, can be grown. And so you really see, after the creation of this Islamic realm, is just this massive crisscrossing of all of these products. Some have even called it a Muslim agricultural revolution. And I'm going to put a resource attached to this stream, which is a nice little article written by another teacher about what they call the Muslim agricultural revolution. So what were the effects? So okay, you have all this food gets spread around. Okay, great, wonderful, Mr. Little. What's the point? So what? Big deal. New food. Well, there's a lot of consequences. First of all, you see a lot of population growth, right? Rice is a staple food, and it becomes the cornerstone of a lot of dishes. So you see a large growth of people across the entire Islamic realm. You also begin to see increased textile production. So India had been producing cotton textiles in India, but then they began to get competition from some parts of the Islamic world, especially in the Middle East. And so you begin to see just a general increase in cotton textile production across Eurasia. India would remain the #1 cotton textile producer until the Industrial Revolution. But the sheer raw number of cotton textiles begins to boom because of the creation of this sort of technological food zone. You see the spread of mechanical knowledge, and in particular, this picture that I've included right here comes from a book that was in Spain that was later translated by the Christians and used in Spain to increase their own knowledge of food production. You see increased commercial contacts. You see more trading than normal. But you also see an increase in the demand for slave labor. And this is something that you should pay attention to, because this is going to become a trend throughout pretty much all of world history. When there is an increased demand for a good, there's going to be an increased demand for labor to produce that good. And when cotton and sugar came to the Middle East, the Muslim rulers began to look for sources of labor for this good. And they turned to Africa, where they imported large numbers of slaves, who they called Zanj. And they concentrated these slaves in what's now Iraq, which turned out to be a really bad idea, because a large concentration of slaves means you potentially get a very large slave revolt, which they did. And it took about I believe it took 15 to 20 years to put the slave revolt down. It just spread all across the heart of the caliphate. So they didn't end up using slaves much after that, but that was kind of a consequence. And that's going to be a trend you're going to see going forward, is that whenever there's a demand for a good, people are going to try to find a cheap source of labor for that good. So do keep that in mind. I promise you're going to see that one again before too long. All right, we're going to talk about one more, and then we're going to take a quick pause and do a little practice. Let's talk about China really quick. So China also saw a massive increase in its agricultural output during this time. Why did that happen? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Now, pre-600, before the year 600, China had actually been broken, like a puzzle piece, broken into many pieces. And when you're broken into many pieces, usually these pieces are fighting, and therefore there's not a lot of agricultural production. So the reunification of China and then the political expansion of China under the Tang Dynasty meant that there was just this boom in agriculture that had not been seen when China was broken apart into many little pieces. And because China was now one, it could promote trade and merchants a lot more than it had when it was a bunch of little teeny tiny states. And therefore, there was an increase in international relations, which brought more food and goods back to China. And there was a greater demand for Chinese goods outside of China, which meant that there was a higher demand to create them so that they could be sold outside of China. Things like silk, porcelain, tea, all sorts of things that were demanded outside of China. Now, something called the tribute system, and this isn't officially in the AP curriculum anymore, but what it was in short was a system by which other nations came to China, they bowed before the emperor, and they said, hey, we acknowledge that you're the center of the universe, and we bring you these gifts in tribute. So that's why it's called the tribute system. Probably the most important thing to know about the tribute system was that it brought a type of rice to China called Champa rice. Has anybody talked about Champa rice in your classrooms, mentioned by any of your teachers? I know they mention it in the Bentley and Ziegler textbook. It's possible if you have that textbook, you might have heard about it. But Champa rice is a very special kind of rice. It's not just any rice. It has special properties. Oh, and Eric's telling me that Bentley actually calls it fast ripening rice. So I might be mistaking it. I might be mistaking that entry in the textbook. But that also kind of gives away what's so important about it. It's fast ripening. In other words, you can harvest it multiple times a year. Oh, that's okay, don't worry. You can harvest it multiple times a year. And so when that rice is introduced, suddenly you go from 1 or 2 rice harvests to 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 if it's a good year, and you have all this extra food, right? Well, what do you do with it? Well, you send it up north. Well, how do you get it up north? Well, thank goodness that Sui dynasty that reunited China built this really big, grand waterway canal. What do we should call it? We'll call it the Grand Canal. They build this canal, and it allows them to send food up north where the majority of the population was at the time and where the capital of China was at the time. And so because of this, you begin to see an increase in the size of cities in China, especially in the north, but also later on down in the south. Like Kaifeng, the capital of the Song dynasty, becomes one of the largest cities in the world at the time. You may have seen in class the Kaifeng scroll, which is this very famous painting of people walking along a bridge and down a river. And that's just how crowded the city of Kaifeng was. You also see the increased commercial production of things like silk and porcelain, because there's more food, now there are more people to make these beautiful things that are now in demand in the rest of the world. So more food also means more people, and more people means more goods, and more goods mean more business, more merchants, right? So you can see the increase in size of cities as well. But an environmental change that comes with along this new rice is that in the demand for farmland, the Chinese farmers begin to terrace the sides of mountains. Now, terracing is a term where you have a mountain, you pretend this is a mountain, right? And you begin to terrace levels of it. You build an artificial land up the side of the mountain. Now, it's not initially very damaging, but long-term terracing can have an effect of eroding mountains. And it can promote floods as well, because you're stripping the mountain of vegetation that it needs to not flood away. So terracing can be long-term very damaging. And so this new fast-ripening rice is great, but it leads to a population boom, which leads to the demand for more people, which leads to terracing, which leads to environmental degradation. And we're going to see this kind of come back a little bit later to haunt China. Anyways, let's take a pause really quick, and let's practice a little bit. Before we do this little MCQ practice, are there any questions just in general before we go ahead and do this? All right, then let's go ahead and let's quick run this multiple choice practice. So here's a chart, and this is the population of China, all the way back from the Han Dynasty right up until the 1990s, in the millions. And so if you look at this chart, which of the answers below provides the best explanation for the increase in China's population between the year 1000 and the year 1200? This little bump right here during the Song Dynasty. Is it A, new crops? Is it B, the increase in the porcelain trade? Is it C, the reunification of China? Or is it D, the loss of northern China to the nomads, which happened around 1100? And so take a second. What do you think it is? Let me put it in the polls really quick. Let me create a poll. Let me just put a poll up, and you can let me know what you think. All right, go ahead and let me know what you think. Is it A, B, C, or D? Okay. So looks like everyone thinks, everyone's got an answer. So let's take a look. Let's see what it is. So of all these answers, which one is the best? Well, I don't know how the loss of territory necessarily leads to a population increase in the realm of from about 80 million to 100 million. I'm not sure how the loss of territory would do that. The reunification of China is important, but that happened way back here during the Sui dynasty. So I'm not really sure, where that kind of would fit in. The boom didn't happen until 1000, or that's what the question is explicitly asking for. The increase in the porcelain trade, well, not really. That's more of a consequence of the population increase, an effect, if you will. And therefore, whoops, I guess I have to put in the little circle. But yes, the answer is A. The best answer of all those answers is that it is the new crops. Now, that's not to say that the reunification isn't also a good answer. Let me just go back really quick. That's not to say that So it's not to say that C, reunification, is a bad answer, but that's just saying that it's not the best answer for between 1,000 and 1,200, right? We want to remember that we stick to the questions. So anyways, really quick, I just want you to notice something. You may have noticed that causes and effects can be concurrent. They're not mutually exclusive. So it's not necessarily that you have no trade, you suddenly get this new food product, and then you have all this trade, right? It could be you have trade, you get a food product, and then you get more trade, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. I think sometimes students fall into this trap where they think that one thing had to exist in isolation to cause something else. So I want you to really see that sometimes causes and effects are concurrent. They provide a positive feedback loop, right? More agriculture leads to more trade, which leads to more agriculture, which leads to more trade, right? So that's a positive feedback loop. You can also get negative feedback loops. We saw this at the end of the classical era where cities declined because trade declined, and because cities declined, trade continued to decline, to the point where in Western Europe, for example, trade almost came to a complete stop right after the fall of the Roman Empire. So positive and negative feedback loops are important when thinking about cause and effect. Just want to make a quick note of that. Let's talk about Europe really quick. So between around 1000 and 1450, why did Europe's production increase? Well, you have the end of invasions and raids. So for many years, between the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of around 1000 of a number of states that were strong enough to defend their borders, you had raids of a lot of exterior powers, Vikings from the north, Arabs, pirates from the south, and nomads known as Magyars, although today we call them Hungarians, who came from the east, from Asia. When these raids all ceased, suddenly people felt safe enough to expand their farming, and they weren't constantly finding their land burned by raiders. And so this led to an expansion of farming, and this, in particular in Northern Europe, led to a lot of deforestation, the desire to get more land, and so this led to the chopping down of forests. Have you ever noticed, if you ever listen to nursery rhymes or children's tales like Hansel and Gretel or Robin Hood or Little Red Riding Hood, where do they all take place? I'm sure you've got to, some of you heard those stories as children. You must know they all take place in a very particular spot, in a very particular cultural zone. Does anyone know what it is? It would be the forest, right? Think about it. Little Red Riding Hood is to go through the forest. Robin Hood is a people's hero who lives in the forest. The three little pigs live on the edge of a forest. Goldilocks goes through the forest and finds the house of the three bears. The forest, in European legend, was a really important place because the forest for so long had dominated their lives until they began to expand their agricultural holdings. And during this time, we begin to see a massive deforestation campaign to get more land, to grow more food. And so in addition to clearing all this forest, political stability was important. But you also have the development of something called the three-field system. Now, there's not a date, like historians don't have a date where they say for sure this is when the three-field system happened. It's gradually believed to have evolved over several hundred years to be perfected in 1000 and practiced by most Europeans by the year 1000. But it basically means you have a field of wheat, you have a field of oats and beans, and you have a dry field that doesn't do anything. You just let it sit for a year. Now, the wheat field is the one you want to grow your food on. The beans you grow, but you're not, and you eat. But the thing is, the beans actually add nutrients to the soil. Once you harvest the beans, you let them, the remain kind of decompose into the soil, and so it will re-energize the soil. Now, they didn't know why when they were doing this. They had no idea why it re-energized the soil. They didn't know about like nitrogen. But they knew that it re-energized the soil, and that was important. And then you have two pieces of technology that get introduced. You have the iron plow, also known as the moldboard plow, which could cut deeper into the soil. And you have something called the horse collar. Now, before 1000, most farming was done with an ox. But in order to, oxen are strong, but they're not fast. Horses are strong and fast. But the problem is the ox collar would compress the chest of the horse and make it hard to move. Right? When the collar was invented, the one around the neck of the horse, this made it possible for the horse to pull a plow and not have its windpipe compressed. and therefore farming could go a little bit faster. So all this was very gradual, happened over a really long time. But what happened as a result? Well, we begin to see a slow increase in the population of Europe. And we begin to see a slow increase in return for Europe, especially a return to trade that had disappeared and largely ceased with the fall of the Roman Empire 600 years earlier. We begin to see a very gradual comeback. We begin to see urbanization coming back. We begin to see cities rebounding, not just castles or monasteries, but actual like whole cities coming back into use, especially in like northern Italy and the Low Countries and what's now like the Netherlands and Belgium. And of course, that meant that there was increased commercial production in these cities, right? The Italian city-states all made specialized goods. The Low Countries specialized in wool. And while this led to a decline for the local lords who had played a big part in the feudal system, I believe we do actually have a stream, Fiveable has a stream that talks about feudalism. This led to an increased power for the kings and the centralized authorities. And it led to increased warfare. Now, you might be thinking, Mr. Little, how does more food lead to more war? Does it lead for more war over food? Well, there's that. But more food means more people. And more people mean bigger armies. And bigger armies means deadlier warfare and more warfare. And so one consequence of increased productivity in Europe is, the rise of cities and the decline of feudalism, but it's also bigger armies and more war. So when we talk about how productivity has many consequences, this is one way to think about it. Let's hop on over to Africa, and specifically East Africa. So East Africa had been recently, by the year 1000, had been populated by a group of people that had come from West Africa called the Bantu, and they brought with them a kind of iron technology. This is going to be really important. This iron technology, combined with goods they got through the contact in the Indian Ocean trade, because if you recall, East Africa is on the Indian Ocean, meant that they began to create large settlements along the coast. These eventually became the Swahili city-states. Further south, you have the creation of a great cattle herding kingdom called the Great Zimbabwe, right? And so the introduction of iron technology and cattle from the Bantu and the introduction of bananas from the Indian Ocean trade led to not only an increase in the population, but the rise of the first large political bodies that East Africa had ever seen, right? Pre-Bantu migration, the only large political body in East Africa was the Kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia. After the introduction of iron technology, after the introduction of bananas and cattle, we begin to see a population explosion and political centralization. In Great Zimbabwe, the king was the king because he had all the cattle, right? They've excavated the Great Zimbabwe, and they found that inside of this gigantic stone palace that was the Great Zimbabwe, that's where all the bones of the dead cattle were. That's where they slaughtered the cattle and they ate the meat because the king had all the cattle. That's what made him powerful. On the east coast of Africa, it was the presence of Islam that made the elites powerful. Many of the rulers of these East African city-states on the Swahili coast, they adopted Islam, right? So, for example, Kilwa was one of those Swahili city-states, and it adopted Islam as its official religion, even though most regular people did not adopt Islam. It was the merchants and the elites who did adopt Islam. And so in this case, a consequence of this productivity is East Africa's increasing connection to the Indian Ocean trade and the increasing presence of Islam because of that increasing connection. And so again, just because it means there's more food for people to eat doesn't necessarily mean that the effects are just population, right? We see here an increase in the presence of an outside religion because of the rise of these great political states and the increasing participation of Africa in the Indian Ocean trade. And let's finally kind of jump on over to the Americas. We'll kind of round things off here with the Americas because we're running out of time. So in the Americas, you have the beginning, in 1000, you have the rise of large either political centers, in the case of the Inca and the Mexica after 1200, or in North America, you have something called the Cahokia, which was a large confederation of tribes. But either way, you have large states who are sponsoring large agricultural projects. And you have a loose network of exchange, according to Robert Strayer. So by the year 1000, before our kind of exploration even starts, beans and maize, also known as corn, which you can see here. This is today's corn. That's corn from way back then. It's amazing how it changes. By this time, those were spread all over the Americas. There's no society that's not eating corn in the Americas, except like way in the north with the Inuit people of what's now Canada. So all, this nutrient-rich, healthy food, like corn and beans, and these increased agricultural techniques. Remember I told you about the Champas in the beginning? Those begin to be seen in Lake Texcoco. And in the Andes, where the Inca are, we also begin to see terracing, just like in China. Because they live in a very mountainous place, you also see terracing up there. And so in the Americas, it really is the rise of large states that can sponsor large agricultural projects that lead to an increase in the population of the people, but also lead to those states getting even bigger. Because once those states have a stable supply of food, they begin to expand outward because they've got an increase in their population. And especially in the Mexica, in central Mexico, you might know them as the Aztecs. They in particular begin to branch out and expand and try to incorporate more of their neighbors into their empire or into their political state. That's one path, but also in the case of the Americas, we simply just straight up see collapse. Cahokia, it's not known for sure why it collapsed. That's why I put a little question mark here. But one of the running theories is that they might have just had too many people to feed. Right? They might have just gotten a population that was too big, about 40,000, and they might have just collapsed because there wasn't enough food to feed this increasing population. You get a few bad years, some drought, or maybe a flood that ruins all the food, and then you just have societal collapse. And people abandon the large centers and they kind of spread out, and that's the end of your religious site. Same thing with the Mayans. And again, we don't really know. The Mayan collapse is kind of a mystery, but usually people believe that it had something to do with some bad weather and just the fact that the Mayans themselves were too large. There were too many Mayans living in a space that was not designed for that many people. Brian Fagan, he's a UCLA historian. He's written a lot about the collapse of the Mayans. And he talks about how, as the Mayans grew bigger, they stressed their environment too much to the point where it only took a few bad years of drought to basically topple many of the city-states of the Maya. So, unlike in China or Europe or Dar al-Islam, in the Americas, one consequence of productivity is just your society collapses because you over-rely on the environment. You over-stress the environment. And so that is one of the things that College Board would like to hear you talk about is the environmental consequences of all this productivity, stressing the environment. All right, are there any questions? And we're running a little short on time, but are there any questions before we take a look at this SAQ really quick? Anything I've said that's confusing or you'd like to know a little more about? Anything at all? All right. So let's kind of wrap this up and really quick just talk a little bit about this SAQ. So here's an SAQ that's written by a Spanish soldier during their expedition to Mexico. And he's describing the Aztec capital or the Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan. And so he says, when we saw all these cities and villages built in the water and the other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading towards Tenochtitlan, we were astounded. We turned back to the great market and the swarms of people buying and selling. Some of our soldiers who had been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople, in Rome, and all over Italy, said they had never seen a market so well laid out, so large, so orderly, and so filled with people. So I don't think the Spanish soldier had agricultural productivity on his mind when he wrote this. But nonetheless, what could be one cause of this, right? What could be one cause? Well, I'm reading this, and I'm seeing that he's talking about cities and villages, and he's talking about specifically Tenochtitlan, okay, capital of the Aztecs, the Mexica. he was astounded, so he's very impressed by what he sees. Talks about a great market. It's lots of people. He also compares it to the great cities of Europe, Constantinople in the east, Rome in the west. And again, he's telling us that it's so filled with people. So what has he described here? He's described architecture? Maybe. He's talked about how there's lots of people. He's also talked about giant markets. Interesting. So if you were to write this SAQ, if you were to try to tackle this SAQ, you might approach it, one cause, you could approach it something like the agricultural productivity of the Mexica led to population growth, right? Or the size of the Mexica state allowed for agricultural goods that led to population growth, or the agricultural production of the Mexica state led to commerce, which led to the great markets that are depicted in this account. So there are many ways to approach this SAQ. I'm gonna take us to our end. I'm always bad about keeping on. Time. But big picture. So what do we take away from all this? What's really the cause of all this global productivity? Well, earlier I said networks, but does anybody have any guesses now that you've sat through the whole thing, you've heard me speak? What are some causes that seem to be in common across the entire world? Right, no matter where we talked about it, there's some common causes. Growing populations. Interesting. I like it. I think there's a case to be made for that. Growing populations. Now, that's a possible cause. Improved agricultural techniques. Also, I think, a big case to be made there. Right? The introduction of new technology and new knowledge, no matter where it was, or just the continued use and improvement over old technologies, I think is also, you can make the case. So increasing populations, also increasing sizes of states and empires, stability in Europe, or just the big agricultural projects in the Americas, the spread of knowledge, like I said, like you said, and the spread of technology, like you said. But also trading technology, agricultural technology, yes, but also trading technology, because trading technology meant there was a greater demand for agricultural goods sometimes. So you're right, agricultural techniques and knowledge, but also trading technology. So for example, in Africa, they received the banana, which led to a population increase, in part because they were trading with the people of the Indian Ocean who had the banana. So those are some, just kind of, you need to look at it big picture wise. Those are some of the big global causes of productivity. Now, you could apply these differently no matter where you are, but these are some of the big picture causes. Now, what are the big picture consequences, right? What are the big picture effects, right? When you look at it as a whole, what are some of the effects that you see all over the world as a result of this increased productivity? And remember what I was saying earlier, right? It's not necessarily that they're mutually exclusive causes and consequences. So for example, Camille also said growing population, that could be both a cause and a consequence, right? A growing population leads to new techniques, which leads to a growing population. It's entirely possible. But some of the big ones are large-scale ecological change. Now, I don't use this negatively, even though it could be, because this also just means more people are farming, and that means they're using more land. That also means they're cutting down more trees. That also means they're driving more species to extinction, possibly. And they're also introducing what we would call invasive species, right? A biology term, but it was happening. With new food is technically an invasive species. So a lot of change to the environment. We see more trade. Again, more people means more trade. So we see an intensification of trade routes. And we see both centralization and decentralization. And, oh, thank you for mentioning that. The spread of diseases, the Black Death. The Black Death, which you might have already talked about in class, but the Black Death is a great one. We talk about the spread of diseases. That's good, right? More people traveling, more trading being done. Spread of diseases like the Black Death is a great example. That was the Mongols in particular, but that's okay. Same idea. So, and I say centralization and decentralization because while it led to centralization in, say, China, it actually led to decentralization in Europe. All right, sorry, I have that. I apologize. I have that backwards. It led to some decentralization in China, but it led to some more centralization in Europe as the kings began to rely on the new cities versus their old feudal lords. So, sorry, it's late over here. I'm getting it all backwards. Anywho, just in case any teachers are watching, I want to quick throw you some ways you can talk about causation in your classroom with your students. Ask your students how they met their best friends. Ask your students about any sports or instruments they played. How did they do it? Why? What has been the effect on their lives? And also, if your students are confused a little bit about causation, try a flow chart. It's a great way to kind of literally see cause, event, effect, kind of like what I've been showing you here today. So these are just some ways you can do cause and consequence, cause and effect in your class. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for sticking through it, and thank you so much for being here this evening. I hope none of you are up too late. I hope you all get to bed and get some sleep. Before we want to go, just want to remind you to think fiveable. Again, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and don't forget to catch some of those awesome streams I mentioned from the top. Again, we got LEQs coming up this week, stimulus-based multiple choice question streams coming up this week. So if you're having a little trouble in class with the writing or the multiple choice questions, those are going to be some excellent streams. You don't want to miss them. But that's all I've got. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to, I'll stick around for maybe another minute. If not, though, again, thanks for coming. I appreciate everybody who came out and participated in the chat. I really appreciate your participation. It makes the whole thing more fun. So like I said, I'll stick around for about 30 more seconds if there's any questions. And if not, have a lovely evening. Demetrius, have a lovely evening. Anybody else who's here, have a lovely night. And hopefully I'll see you guys sometime in the future.